Tonight at 10, 3 days of mourning in Brazil after a plane carrying one of the country's top football teams crashed in Colombia. There were just 6 survivors from 77 on board when the plane came down on a mountainside. On board were players from Chapecoense, a small team which has enjoyed notable success in Brazilian football. The team's fans have been gathering to pay their respects along with the Brazilian president.
I want to express my sadness for the awful incident which has caused the death of a football team and many more who accompanied them from Chapecó, which happened early this morning. It is extremely sad.
We'll be reporting from Colombia as investigators say there's still no sign of what caused the crash. Also tonight, the former youth football coach, Barry Bennell, has been charged with 8 sexual assault offences against a teenage boy. The UN says up to 16,000 people have fled the fighting in eastern Aleppo as Syrian government forces advance deeper into rebel areas. The potential of nuclear fusion and why British scientists fear that their pioneering work could be damaged by Brexit. And Simone Biles, one of the greatest gymnasts of all time, talks to us about global success at the age of 19.
And here in the south, for their own safety, the council's bringing in dozens of rough sleepers as temperatures plummet. And programming their future, why Brexit is proving to be a boost for this business on the south coast.
Good evening. 3 days of national mourning have been declared in Brazil after a plane carrying one of the country's best-known football teams, Chapecoense, crashed in Colombia. The authorities say that 6 of the 77 people on board survived. The chartered aircraft flying to Colombia via Santa Cruz in Bolivia was reported to have experienced some electrical problems, but there are also some suggestions, not confirmed, that it may have been short of fuel. Our correspondent Ali Makboul is in Colombia and he's just sent us this report.
The plane bringing the players, coaching staff, journalists and 9 crew members was just minutes away from landing when it came down just outside the city of Medellin. Officials were initially optimistic that as many as 30 people had survived. In the end, the more they searched, the more bodies they found. Chapecoense had been travelling to Colombia to take part in the Copa Sudamericana. These pictures are from the departure lounge. And these images from on the plane show goalkeeper Danilo on the left and defender Alan Ruschel, both initially reported to have survived. Danilo later confirmed to have died. Well, miraculously, 3 members of the team, 2 crew and 1 travelling reporter did survive and were brought to local hospitals, all saved by the fact that the plane didn't burst into flames on impact. Dr. Guillermo Molina, director of this hospital, told me the survivors would now face unimaginable trauma. One of the players has had to have his leg amputated, he tells me. As well as losing close friends, he's seen his life's dream come to an end. But it's incredible he survived at all. These are images released by the Brazilian team Chapecoense, taken just last week when they won the semi-final of what is one of South America's biggest club competitions. The game they were due to play in Colombia would have been the biggest night in the club's history after what had been a fairy tale season for this small, unfancied team from southern Brazil. Instead, at the club's headquarters, fans gathered in shock, struggling to absorb the news that many of their heroes had been killed.
The last match they played here, we were so happy. We went to sleep with a dream and now we've woken up to a nightmare. That's what everyone here is saying.
We were almost there. It was the best moment of our lives. All the Brazilian teams were supporting us. We were the most loved team in Brazil today.
At training, the players of Real Madrid and Barcelona bowed their heads in remembrance. And as the world of football paid tribute, the Wembley Arch was lit in the colours of the team hit by such shocking tragedy. Whatever the survivors can tell authorities about the moments leading up to the crash will help investigators. But the focus now is on mourning. Ali Makboul, BBC News, in Medellin.
Well, British investigators are on their way to Colombia to help the authorities there as they try to establish the cause of the crash. The team from the Air Accidents Investigation Branch are expected to arrive sometime tomorrow, and our transport correspondent Richard Westcott has more details.
This soon after a crash, there are always more rumours than facts, but we do have some clues as to what might have happened. The first of those clues comes from the radar track. Now, if you look closely, the pilot is clearly circling rather than heading for a runway. He'd reportedly told controllers about an electrical fault. One experienced pilot says that manoeuvre could make sense.
But when you train for emergencies, you train to basically, as a crew, buy yourself time to be able to run through the checklist that you have, diagnose the problem, run through the checklist fully and configure the aeroplane and prepare the crew for any kind of non-normal circumstances that might be involved in the approach and landing. And so if that needs a little bit of time, you would typically find a space to go and circle around.
Now let's take a look at the images from the scene itself. And you can see it's mountainous and the weather was bad. The pieces of the aircraft look quite large and close together, which suggests it didn't break up in the air. There are also some reports that it might have run out of fuel. This is the actual aircraft that came down, a 17-year-old British Avro RJ-85. Similar planes are used for the Royal Flight, ferrying the Queen around the globe.
It's got an excellent safety record and been used all over the world, both for passengers and freight operations. And so what we'll start to look at is, has it been maintained well? Have parts been upgraded as necessary?
UK air accident investigators are now heading to Colombia to help. Richard Westcott, BBC News.
Let's go live to Medellin in Colombia tonight, and Ali Makboul, my colleague, is there. Alim, tell us a little more about what you've been able to understand now from this investigation that's underway.
Well, we've been hearing rumours all day about whether or not the black box has been found. Investigators say now that it hasn't been found because that just isn't the priority. That just isn't the priority for their investigation right now. That is still finding the bodies at the crash site, which is just over this hill behind me. They now say they've recovered all the bodies, but they are still in the process of removing them from the mountainside. We know now that Brazil is going to send a military plane here to take those bodies back for an incredibly sad repatriation mission. But we also hear that some families couldn't wait that long. Some families have traveled here from Brazil, distraught, of course, and a call went out earlier in the day for people who could speak Portuguese to help give them information, but also help counsel them in their grief. Now, the team that Chapecoense was due to face tomorrow in that final, Atlético Nacional, has said that, of course, the title they were due to play for should be given to this club that has suffered so much. But also, they want a memorial event to happen at the very time the team was supposed to take the field for what should have been their greatest moment.
Alim, thanks very much again. Ali Makboul, our correspondent, with the latest on that investigation in Medellin in Colombia. The former youth football coach Barry Bennell has been charged with 8 offences of sexual assault against a boy under the age of 14. He's due to appear before magistrates in Cheshire next month. The charges come after more than 20 former youth players waived their right to anonymity to say they were abused by football coaches as children. The chairman of the Football Association has said that his organisation is facing one of the biggest crises in its history as the potential number of abusers and victims starts to emerge. Our sports editor Dan Rowan has the story.
Former football youth team coach Barry Bennell, tonight charged with 8 offences of sexual assault against a boy under the age of 14 in the 1980s. The latest development in a story that shocked the sport. Here at Wembley, they're no strangers to controversy. But this is about more than football. It's left lives ruined. The FA chairman telling me today he was under no illusions over the sport's sex abuse scandal.
Could it be the biggest crisis the FA's ever faced?
I think it's certainly the biggest one I can remember. I think the moral consequences of failing to deal with some of these issues in the past we must get to the bottom of. So we believe we're doing as much as we can to make sure that we step up to the mark and are in a position to be able to disclose everything that happened.
These are just some of the former players who have come forward to say they were victims of sex abuse. The FA and several clubs are conducting their own inquiries, but many want to know why it's taken until now.
I don't know if there's a cover-up or not. I really don't know. I suspect that, like many big problems, people aren't drawn towards them. But in the 1990s, society was sleepwalking, and we were part of that problem.
Tonight, Chelsea became the latest club to launch an investigation. There's concerns a former employee who worked for them in the 1970s and who since died. Meanwhile, 9 police forces, including in Scotland, have now received reports of abuse by an unknown number of perpetrators. An NSPCC helpline set up with the FA has received a growing number of calls, and this afternoon the scandal was discussed in Parliament.
Today, my honourable friend, the Minister for Sport, will write to all national governing bodies to ask them to redouble their efforts in protecting children that play their sports.
2 weeks after this scandal began, the FA here at Wembley are desperately trying to get a grip of a crisis that threatens to spiral out of control. The governing body all too aware of the seriousness of the potential consequences.
Is the threat of big payouts, compensation, something which worries you?
It always worries me because every pound we pay out in compensation is a pound we won't put into an artificial grass pitch in a deprived community across the UK.
Do you expect to be paying out some compensation?
I don't know the answer to that question, because what we're trying to do is to get the facts, release the facts, and accept the consequences of those facts.
Burnell has now been discharged from this Hertfordshire hospital after being found unconscious on Friday night in what police called a fear for welfare incident. He'll appear at South Cheshire Magistrates Court next month. Dan Rowan, BBC News.
The United Nations says up to 16,000 people have fled the fighting in eastern Aleppo as Syrian government forces advance deeper and deeper into rebel areas. Officials have described the humanitarian situation there as deeply alarming. 3 areas in eastern Aleppo have been taken from the rebels, and the situation on the ground for civilians has been described by one United Nations spokesman as almost beyond the imagination. Our chief international correspondent, Lise Doucette, reports now from the Syrian capital, Damascus.
Bombs are dropping again on East Aleppo. It's already a wasteland after years of war. But the search for targets doesn't stop, nor does the desperate quest to find places to hide. This is the agony of daily life and death in Aleppo. For those who remain trapped in what the UN calls a slow-motion descent into living hell.
There is a lot of bombing, devastation, cluster bombs. They are hitting us with everything from all sides. Our children are all dead.
Now there's a chance to escape. As Syrian forces push forward and rebel fighters retreat, thousands of families are seizing this moment. They're on the move with whatever worldly goods they can carry. Many are now heading to the government side of Aleppo. At the center, it's Russian allies who are handing out blankets. Among those who make it here, some say they would have left rebel territory sooner if they'd been able to.
The situation is very bad. We didn't have anything to eat, not even bread.
But there are also reports young men are being detained and questioned by Syrian security forces. The momentum is now clearly with the government. This video, filmed by its military, shows what rebel fighters left behind as they fled, in the face of a stunning advance. Over the past few days alone, Syrian forces backed by their allies recaptured nearly half of rebel-held territory in the east of the city. And they're not stopping. An Aleppo MP shows me where the battle is heading next, despite urgent calls for the fighting to stop.
The human suffering should end. It's time it ends, but the only way it ends is when terrorists leave our city. That's it. It's our duty to get rid of terrorists. Terrorism should not be in Aleppo and should not be in Syria.
They're vowing to take back all of the city within weeks, but rebel commanders say they're not giving up. So for now, the battle goes on, whatever the human cost. Well, not a day goes by without a senior UN official or a Western leader expressing alarm at the immense and growing human suffering in East Aleppo. But that falls largely on deaf ears here. They accuse the West of hypocrisy, saying that in the same way the West is backing a campaign against so-called Islamic State in the Iraqi city of Mosul, that there should be a campaign in Aleppo against an al-Qaeda-linked group. And so the battle will go on. And they hope they'll have all of Aleppo in government hands by the end of January, when they hope there'll be a new American president who agrees with them.
Lise, thanks very much for the update. Lise Doucette, our chief international correspondent in Damascus. Well, the US President-elect Donald Trump is holding further talks with Rudy Giuliani, the former mayor of New York, on the key position of US Secretary of State. The search for a nominee who'd be acceptable to most in the Republican Party is proving to be rather tricky, and it's included so far Mitt Romney, who's been highly critical of Mr. Trump in the past, and General David Petraeus. During the day, Mr. Trump chose an outspoken critic of President Obama's healthcare reforms to be his health secretary, as Sarah Smith reports now.
Just a few blocks from Broadway, they're putting on quite a show inside Trump Tower. Here's campaign manager Kellyanne Conway appearing in the lobby with two nearly naked cowboys. Team Trump have turned the normally staid transition process into a pageant.
Gonna be a busy day. Stay tuned.
The man who once owned the Miss Universe contest even calls contenders for the highest offices of state the finalists. Representing Tennessee, Senator Bob Corker arriving at the Tower of Power to interview for Secretary of State. Seeking the same position, Mitt Romney, who's due for dinner later tonight. They've met once since the election. Trump says he could be Secretary of State because he looks the part. But he also sanctioned this attack.
I think that there was the Never Trump movement, and then there was Governor Mitt Romney. He went out of his way to hurt Donald Trump. He gave two speeches that I can recall in this calendar year, and they were both about Donald Trump.
Like this one in March this year.
Donald Trump is a phony, a fraud. His promises are as worthless as a degree from Trump University.
Trump responded then by saying Romney wanted his backing when he ran for president.
He was begging for my endorsement. I could have said, Mitt, drop to your knees. He would have dropped to his knees. He was begging. Sure.
Trump loyalist Rudy Giuliani really wants the job as Secretary of State, but his overseas business interests might stand in the way. Retired General David Petraeus has been interviewed too, despite an earlier scandal over his leaking classified information to his mistress.
I was with him for about an hour. He basically walked us around the world, showed a great grasp of a variety of the challenges that are out there and some of the opportunities as well.
Trump's agenda is so unclear, all his nominees are scrutinised to see what they tell us about his policies. Appointing the Congressman Tom Price as health secretary suggests Trump intends to try and dismantle President Obama's healthcare reforms. Many more appointments still need to be made, but it seems Trump may be bored behind his desk. He's off on a victory tour from Thursday, clearly craving the roar of the crowd once more.
Now, one more conversation we know that Donald Trump had today was with Theresa May. She telephoned him for their second conversation since Trump's election. We know they talked about NATO and the importance of member states meeting the commitment of spending 2% of GDP on defence. During the campaign, Donald Trump suggested that the US might not come to the defence of member states who didn't meet that spending commitment. We don't know if he repeated that threat again today. We're still waiting, of course, for an announcement on Secretary of State, but it looks like he is so enjoying the drama he has created around this selection process. I don't think he's going to rush to the finale on that one.
All right, Sarah, thanks very much. Sarah Smith there with the latest at the White House. Now, during the day, police have released CCTV images of a violent road rage attack in which a motorist deliberately reverses his truck into a lorry. And after trying to get into the cabin with the drivers and passenger locked inside, the man then gets a spade and proceeds to smash the window. And this incident happened after the two vehicles collided on the M62 in Eccles in Greater Manchester earlier this month. And police have now said that they're appealing for witnesses to come forward if they recognise people involved. Now, the Prime Minister has unveiled measures to tackle boardroom excesses and to ensure that companies can justify high levels of executive pay. Among the options being considered are pay ratios to highlight the difference between the highest and average salaries within a business, and binding votes by shareholders on the pay packages of chief executives. Our business editor, Simon Jack, explains a little more.
It's felt at times like a case of the people versus business. Mike Ashley of Sports Direct offering poor pay and conditions. Sir Philip Green profiting while BHS pensioners suffer. And Bob Dudley paid millions while BP lost billions. The kind of behaviour a new sheriff vowed to crack down on.
We all know that in recent years the reputation of business as a whole has been bruised.
That when a minority of businesses and business figures appear to game the system and work to a different set of rules. I'm putting you on warning. This can't go on anymore. A change has got to come, and this party is going to make it.
The boardroom. This is a battleground that Theresa May chose right from the start of her prime ministership. Decisions taken in here, she said, has seen pay inequality explode, seen workers' rights and working conditions eroded, and have fostered a deep distrust in business. Today, the government put ideas on the table on how to restore that trust. These include publishing the gap in pay between the average worker and the chief executive, potentially have annual binding shareholder votes, which mean pay packets could be vetoed, and more input from workers on whether top executives are worth their big pay deals.
We're only worth it if our customers think we are. And that's why I think fundamentally all of us in big business need to listen and play our part in making sure that the country does work for everyone. And it's entirely appropriate that the government is reviewing all of these arrangements.
But if we're honest...
In October, Theresa May promised a workers' voice on boards. Today's proposals suggest independent directors might play that role.
Well, workers on boards means workers on boards. That's what the Prime Minister promised, and that's what we wanted to stick to. And, you know, it can't be a case of a glorified suggestion box or an advisory council or somebody else on millions of pounds pretending to be a worker on board. It's got to be somebody who can represent the perspective and experience of working people.
In the 1970s, the boss earned around 20 times as much as the shop floor worker. Now it's 130 times. The government seem keen today to encourage rather than impose changes. Workers may think that's a far cry from all the fighting talk they've heard. Simon Jack, BBC News.
The President of the European Council, Donald Tusk, and the German Chancellor, Angela Merkel, have both rejected a call from a group of MPs and peers who demanded an early agreement on the future status of EU citizens in the UK and UK citizens in the EU. Mr Tusk said that their demands had nothing to do with reality, and he said it was Britain's delay in triggering the Brexit process that prevented the issue from being tackled in the first place. Our Europe editor, Katya Adler, is in Brussels. And Katya, in your view, is this evidence of the EU taking a tougher approach before these talks start?
Well, Hugh, it was a bit of a slapdown, an attempt by Chancellor Merkel and President Tusk to put the government in its place as they see it. Mrs Merkel said she was extremely clear with the Prime Minister when last they met that there was strict protocol to follow. First, she said Britain had to trigger those formal Brexit talks. Then EU leaders would decide amongst themselves what form those talks would take, and only then would Britain be invited into those discussions about future relations. I am hearing increasingly irritated noises at high political levels in Berlin, here in Brussels and in other EU capitals. EU leaders suspect the government of trying to peddle bilateral sweetness to individual countries like Poland over the status of its citizens who live in the UK, like to the Baltics with a nod that the UK will remain tough over Russia, with the hope of breaking EU unity ahead of those formal Brexit talks. So the subtext of the Tusk-Merkel statements today, the intended subtext was, forget it. You UK chose to leave us, and once you start that formal process, we call the shots.
OK, Katya, thanks very much for that analysis there in Brussels tonight. Katya Adler, our Europe editor. Now, nuclear fusion, according to its proponents, could develop into a source of power which is almost limitless and produces hardly any waste. The European Union is one of the leaders in the field, and since the 1970s, its main fusion laboratory has been based at Culham in Oxfordshire. But the prospect of Brexit has created uncertainty among the staff there. DAR Science editor David Shuckman has been given exclusive access to their latest research.
Not the easiest of places to get into.
I've entered a bold experiment to develop a new way of generating power. Here at Culham in Oxfordshire, this device is researching fusion, part of a long-running dream to create an endless and carbon-free source of electricity.
They're trying to keep this place as clean as possible because the plan is to try to recreate the process of fusion that goes on inside a star. Now, incredibly, when this place is up and running, where I'm standing right now will be 4 times hotter than the sun.
The goal is to make a new kind of nuclear power station with fusion at its heart, producing far less waste than existing nuclear stations. But the engineering is fiendishly complicated. And the people working on the project here at Culham face another kind of challenge as well: Brexit. This is a collective European effort hosted by Britain. We do pay in, but get millions more out. A contract with the EU runs until 2018, and no one knows if it'll continue. A camera glimpses the process of fusion at work, but for how much longer?
This is the world's greatest fusion lab. And if we don't find a way to make an agreement with Europe, this will all go. And our lead in this area will have been dissipated.
For several decades at this site, Britain has managed Europe's experimental fusion reactor known as JET, an installation that's proved the principle of fusion and helped bring it closer to reality.
Since the 70s, this has been Europe's main research centre for fusion. The European Commission has provided most of the funding. European scientists have been back and forth in their thousands, and the work is now at a crucial stage. So the Brexit vote has come as a real bombshell.
I think it's a concern for not only for the EU people who are here, but also for the English people, because I think it puts the whole institute at risk.
I'm a little bit worried by my family, what is going to happen, for example, to my children, if I'm going to stay here, if the work is going to continue.
I mean, we all enjoy working here, and we don't want to move our jobs, but if if the European Union decides to close the program, then we may have to find different places of employment.
It may be many years before this great British achievement reaches the power station stage.
Britain pioneered fusion research in the 50s, so what now? Well, a government spokesperson said the UK does want to keep the European effort going. One option might be to copy Switzerland, which is part of the fusion project, but outside the EU, though it does have to accept freedom of movement. Until all this is sorted, Europe's fusion dream will remain uncertain. David Shuckman, BBC News, at Culham in Oxfordshire.
The athlete Jessica Ennis-Hill is to be awarded the gold medal from the 2011 World Championships after the woman who beat her was stripped of the title. The British heptathlete, who announced her retirement from athletics last month, had finished runner-up. But Russia's Tatiana Chernova has now had her results annulled because of doping. In a statement, Jessica Ennis-Hill said she was thrilled to be triple world champion. The American gymnast Simone Biles was one of the stars of the Rio Olympics. She won a record 4 gold medals under bronze. At the age of just 19, she's considered one of the greatest gymnasts of all time. A few months after Rio, she's ready to reflect on her summer of remarkable success, and in an exclusive interview for the BBC's 100 Women's season, she's been speaking to our North America correspondent Rajini Vaidyanathan.
And this is really very special. 1 flip, 2 flips, full twisting double back, so easy, so powerful.
Few gymnasts rival Simone Biles. Her ability to soar seamlessly through the air won her legions of fans and 4 gold medals in Rio.
I don't have a secret. I guess I've just always trusted myself in my gymnastics, and I've been very fortunate and blessed with the body that I've been born with. Sometimes my head gets ahead of my body, actually. I'm like, I can do this, and you're like, you know what, Simone? You probably can't.
Simone's gift for gymnastics started young as she jumped and leapt off furniture. She was adopted by her grandparents after her biological mother struggled with addiction.
I thought like everyone was adopted, so it never fazed me, and it's, I don't know, to me it's never been any different because it's all I've ever known. My parents have always taught us to strive to perfection, and at the beginning of the year, my mom would always make me write down goals on a piece of paper and take it to her. And so that's kind of how I always was very well driven, because I always had the next goal in mind.
Only one American woman has ever won gold on the vault. Simone Biles.
In September, she achieved another goal when she visited the White House, where she was honoured by President Obama, who even did the splits with her.
I got to present an award to them, like a surfboard that all the 2016 Olympians signed. We were taking funny pictures, throwing fruits and vegetables. It was crazy.
So too is the attention Simone now receives. At the age of just 19, she's achieved celebrity status. Dealing with her newfound fans can be hard.
The crying ones usually get me. I'm like, please stop crying, you're gonna make me cry. I'm like, why are you crying? So it makes me happy and sad to see them cry, because it's tears of joy, but it scares me sometimes.
But on the mat, Simone is fearless. She says she hopes to compete in the 2020 Olympics and one day perhaps become a nurse. Of course, this teenager from Texas has already reached great heights. Regina Vaidyanathan, BBC News.
Regina there enjoying her conversation with the great Simone Biles. That's it from us here on BBC One. It's time for the news where you are. Have a good night.